Wanasema law kazi gani blow holes kwa heads na chest si protect.
I use music to do this work. So najua mko na kalamu. Naomba mko wanafunzi
Ruinge, also an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, an ardent human rights defender.
Tocha ni janga kubwa. Tocha ni, can go back to your seats as we just. Tocha ni.
So today is not a routine event. It happens every year. This day is marked as a UN Day in solidarity with their victims, their families, and also survivors of torture and other forms of ill treatment. But it's not that we come to this room because it's routine to come to this room. No. Today is just a culmination of 12 months of the struggle for justice, accountability, and healing for survivors of torture and other forms of ill treatment, including extrajudicial executions and forced disappearances, fear, intimidation, physical injuries, psychological trauma of our brothers and sisters in this country. We will not and we shall not continue misbehaving as we have been doing, that we will stop these inhumane acts against our fellow citizens.
Today, as we gather here to commemorate the International Day in support of victims of torture, it is crucial that we acknowledge the profound impact of torture on survivors, victims, and their communities. And it's actually good that we've heard firsthand what the effects of torture can be. It's not just physical and mental, as Isabella reminded us, but it extends to the family and the community at large. In particular, I want to emphasize the significance of reparations as a means of acknowledging the atrocities committed, providing compensation, and facilitating healing for those affected by torture. We all know that torture is a brutal violation of human rights, leaving lasting physical, psychological, and emotional scars on its victims. In Kenya, like in many other parts of the world, numerous individuals have endured unimaginable suffering at the hands of those in power. We all know of the horror stories of Nyayo Chambers, as we've heard from Mashira. We know of Baby Pendo and the Kianjakoma brothers, who were brutally murdered after being tortured to death. Many Kenyans have experienced severe physical pain, endured humiliation, and been subjected to degrading treatment that has shattered their sense of self and security. The consequences of torture extend far beyond the immediate physical and psychological harm inflicted on the individual. Survivors often face lifelong challenges such as chronic pain, we've heard it here from Mzee Mwaura, disability, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. These wounds affect their ability to engage in work, maintain relationships, and participate fully in society. Furthermore, the trauma experienced by survivors reverberates through their families and communities, perpetuating a cycle of suffering. It is our moral duty, brothers and sisters, to support victims and survivors of torture by providing them with reparations. Reparations serve as a tangible acknowledgement of the pain and suffering endured by these individuals. They represent a commitment to rectifying the injustices perpetrated against them and play a vital role in the healing process. Never again. Compensation for victims of torture is essential on multiple levels. Firstly, it provides financial support to help survivors rebuild their lives. You've heard the costs that people have to endure, medical, educational, and all the other things that go with daily living. Many victims face economic hardships due to their inability to work or secure employment as a result of their physical and psychological injuries. Reparations allows them the means to access necessary medical treatment, rehabilitative services, and vocational training, empowering them to regain their independence and reintegrate into society. Secondly, reparations contribute to the restoration of dignity and self-worth. By officially recognizing the harm suffered, the government sends a powerful message that the victims are not forgotten, never again, and that their pain matters and that they deserve justice. It validates their experiences and helps alleviate the shame and stigma often associated with being a survivor of torture. Moreover, reparations have the potential to foster reconciliation with communities. By acknowledging the harm caused and providing compensation, a pathway for healing is opened. This can promote social cohesion, trust, and understanding among different groups, including even the police, contributing to the rebuilding of a society free from torture and related violations. In implementing a reparations fund, it is crucial to ensure it is comprehensive, accessible, and tailored to the specific needs of survivors. This fund should include a range of reparations, such as financial compensation, medical, psychological support, and they must be designed with the active participation of survivors and their communities, allowing them to have a voice in shaping the processes and outcomes. Additionally, it is vital to address the root causes of torture and prevent its recurrence. This involves strengthening legal frameworks, promoting human rights, and fostering a culture of accountability. By holding perpetrators accountable and addressing the systemic factors that enable torture, we can strive towards a society free from torture and related violations. In conclusion, brothers and sisters, as we commemorate today, the International Day in Support of Victims of Torture, let us remember the profound impact of torture on survivors, victims, and their communities in Kenya. We've heard it firsthand, and I'm sure many of us also know people who've experienced it, even if they're not who have experienced it. Reparations are an essential tool in acknowledging the suffering endured, providing compensation, and fostering healing. And by supporting victims and survivors of torture, we as a society take a significant step towards building a more just, compassionate, and inclusive society. On behalf of the IMLU board, and I guess IMLU at large, I can confirm our commitment towards preventing torture and supporting victims and survivors of torture. Never again.
Every 26th of June, the 4 United Nations torture mechanisms, and here we are speaking about the Committee Against Torture, the Subcommittee for the Prevention of Torture, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, and the board which I chair of the Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture, we issue a thematic joint statement addressing a theme of topical concern on the global situation of torture. Now, I should just say, because I'll not speak to it again, I'll just mention it and say that our statement this year is on the absolute prohibition of torture in armed conflict. And the statement is available online, and so you can look at it. Now, the theme of my address to you today is using reparations to foster healing for victims of torture. Now, 13 years ago, when we gave ourselves a new constitution, we as Kenyans committed to honor those who heroically struggled to bring freedom and justice to our land. Now, it cannot be that by this pledge we only bestowed respect to the land freedom fighters. In other words, those who fought for independence. It seems to me that this was a commitment also to honor all the Kenyans who, after independence, toiled thanklessly and suffered for many decades, particularly under the Jomo Kenyatta and Arap Moi regimes, at great physical and psychological cost to themselves to realize the 2010 Constitution. And I think we've just had illustrations of that in the previous session. Now, the Constitution commands each one of us to respect, to uphold, and to defend it. So you then think about the Constitution, that it affirms that every person has the right not to be subjected to torture in any manner, whether physical or psychological. And also the right not to be treated or punished in a cruel, inhuman, or degrading manner. The case I wish to make today is that providing healing to victims of torture is a calling, a command of the Constitution, and that we defy the Constitution each time we fail to execute that calling. And indeed, my concern is that in recent years, despite all the work we are doing, despite all the great work which Imlo and others are doing here, my concern is that Kenyans are becoming forgetful. Kenyans are caught up in amnesia, that we are falling into a comfort zone where the prevention of torture and the provision of redress for its victims is no longer a priority for us. I do fear that we have increasingly become bogged down by far too many wants and cares, that we are mired in a palpable lethargy of toil, most recently made manifest by the budgetary millstone which the government has placed on us. So my challenge to citizens today is take a moment to imagine the circumstance of an individual facing up to torture in the dark chambers of Nyayo House in the 1980s. We just had one speaker this morning. Can you imagine an individual going through this torture even when he could not imagine or countenance how the Moi regime might no longer be in power? So you are tortured and you don't know. The regime might still be there 10 years or 20 years later. That is the 1980s. So then the question I ask is, dare we today give up on victims of torture? Are we today giving up on victims of torture when this happened to them that long ago, when it seemed as if there was no hope at all?
Media, members of the media who are here, if you'd like interviews of Alancho, we are available for interviews. Those who have survived this horror are also available for interviews. So if you would like that, please speak to Sarah.